name is Lynn. I'm an alcoholic.
Lynn.
So, I now realize after a lifetime of addiction and a short time of recovery that I was actually born an alcoholic. And there's a lot of evidence to prove that to me over the course of the time I've been in my recovery now. But I'll just start off by saying there was an incident when I was 16, and it was my first suicide attempt. It was a serious suicide attempt, but we kept it a secret in the family, and I moved on from that, but I was very withdrawn and very shy, and I did not socialize much with my peers or school friends at all. My mum was an alcoholic, and so we had an alcoholic home, but I didn't know any different, and nor did my sisters. There was no fighting. It was a loving home. And we didn't realize alcoholism until much later. I only picked up my first drink, my first substance, which was alcohol, at the age of 19. I also met my husband at the age of 19. And we started a relationship. He came from a dysfunctional home as well. And we mixed with a drinking crowd, and he was sort of like, I suppose, my God at the time, because he was able to carry me through my young adult years, because I was under his shadow and his wing. It was wonderful because he was the main guy. He was the most good-looking guy, and he had a motorbike, and he was the bad guy in the group, and that appealed to me actually. So we got married very young. I was only 21 and he was 22, which was, today when I look back, it's absolutely ridiculous. But we planned this perfect life that we hadn't had, and we set out to achieve it. And one of the things on our list was that we wouldn't have children until much later in life. So we had our 2 children, my son Tim and my daughter Cass, in my late 20s. And that was part of the plan. So that was really good. I stopped work, and I was going to become a stay-at-home mom and do all the right things moms do. And my expectations were completely shattered. I just could not. I didn't know how to be a mom. I really didn't. I hadn't a clue. I was actually scared of my children. I would tiptoe in and just pray they would be sleeping, or I would crawl on the floor so they didn't even see me to check on them. And I really didn't know how to manage them, and I didn't feed them. I didn't breastfeed my children. I didn't want to do that. There was no motherly connection in the beginning. But I was a stay-at-home mom, and that was my job. That's what my husband was pointing out to me. So for the first 10 years of their lives, it was an absolute struggle. I was drinking every day by the time I had my children. And in my 30s now, my husband remained in his social status in his life, and I was in mine. And I just could not do these kids. I really couldn't. I started to give them a teaspoon of Stopain every night in the bath, because my justification was that they need to have a good night's sleep because they've been screaming all day, basically. And I would justify it and blame and so on. And the bottle says 5 mils, not to exceed 10 days. Well, my 5 mils of Stopain with my 2 children went on for years. And it did put them to sleep, and I could pass out. It wasn't that I needed to sleep. It would be a time of day that I would pass out with my drinking. And I was able to drink like that because I was alone at home and there was nobody around to see. So I could lie about it, I could hide it, I couldn't control it. And there were times in the early years where I did try and stop, and I couldn't. And that scared me, but I still didn't say I was an alcoholic. I just blamed all my surroundings about the fact that I had to drink. But I had to go out to the world after they were about 2 or 3. I couldn't hibernate and isolate with these 2 little children. And that's when I began to wear my masks, and that got me through my entire addiction, is wearing masks. And the first few masks I wore were just to suit the situation, to be this perfect mom to the outside world. And it worked, and when it worked, I was pretty smug about it. I thought, well, this is a wonderful solution. I can drink, and I could go out, and I could be this mom, and I could work at the tuck shop, or I could be on the PTA, and, it was great. And I could go home and I could drink, and nobody knew. So how much people knew or not, I will still never know. But those masks I started to build right through my addiction. So I'm just going to talk about one incident in my 30s, because I've got a lot to share. And this was about the children. I took them to primary school. They were about 6 and 7. And I dropped them at the school, and I went to a champagne breakfast. One of my friends was turning 40. So that was a group of friends that I drank with. And so lunchtime came and went, and I didn't notice the time. And when I did notice, I was pissed already, and I had to get back to the school to pick them up. And, the journey was horrific back home. And I kept my whole build up to picking up these 2 children was, what are they going to think about me? I've got to have some story. I've got to find something and to justify why I'm late. I can't be this terrible mother that's forgotten her kids. And I was making it all about me. I had no thought about the kids being stuck at school. And I remember rocking up there and seeing the 2 of them, and they were standing up 2 little soldiers between teacher, and I skidded up there and jumped out the car, and I was telling the teacher all about this accident on the road, because there was no accident, and the dead people lying around. I lied upon lie upon lie. And, I just gave no thought to the kids' situation at all. And I remember sort of tossing them into the car, and they were crying, and I turned around and I shouted at them to stop crying. They're too old to cry. And I had to blackmail them not to tell their dad about that incident. But they were young, and I was the only mom they had, and they had no comparison. So they had to accept their fate with me, for that period in their lives. So, I moved on from that, and then moving into my 40s, I still thought I was 19. I acted like a teenager. I loved it when my kids were getting to 13 and 14, because I could be on their level, and I could rock up at the school to pick them up in my fancy car in a sarong and straight from the beach, and I thought it was cool. And I didn't realize that it embarrassed them, and that they were humiliated by my behavior. I just thought I was a cool mom. So I was stuck in this 19-year-old phase of my life, really forever. And what happened in those early teenage years for them was, I enabled them to drink early because it enabled me to drink. And they relied on me for the first few years to buy the alcohol, and I still thought that was pretty cool, that was this cool thing. And what I didn't realize, of course I'll share about this a bit later too, is that I believe that my kids, those first months of alcohol intake was a trigger from the time I fed them the stropan, to them drinking. So I got through those years, and they must have gotten through. I don't remember too much. I was pissed every day. I would pass out every day. Their dad lived in Joburg, and we lived at the coast. So from Monday to Thursday, I had literally free reign, and I took full advantage of that time. And in my 40s, things didn't go too well with my husband's business, and eventually he had a lot of trouble in his life as well, and we had to move back to Joburg, and the teenagers stayed in Durban. And once again, I was left on my own, and I left them on their own. I left them without any role model. I had taught them no values, no principles, no boundaries, nothing of benefit for them to begin their young adult lives. And so I used to just hear bits and pieces of what was going on in their lives at that stage, and they were young adults. They got married. Each of them got married, and there was a time in each of these engagements where they came to me individually And they just asked me and they begged me, Mom, please, just don't be drunk on our wedding day. And so I made these promises, I made these promises. Of course I wouldn't, and I thought, well, I won't, I will not do that, I will not. And for both weddings, I was sober on the day. I was sober on the day, but I was the most miserable person in the room. And I remember actually being angry and resentful because they had put non-alcoholic champagne on the bridal table. And that's how sick I was, to realize that they had put some thought into this situation. And here I was just getting angry and resentful because there was non-alcoholic champagne on the table. And so after they were married, they both lived in Durban for a while, and I lost touch with my daughter. She put herself into recovery. I totally admire and respect her for that, but it had nothing to do with me being a good mother whatsoever. I think I must be the only mother in history at the treatment center who phoned and fought with counsellors to let her go. She wasn't an alcoholic. She was definitely not an alcoholic, and they were to release her immediately, which they didn't do, So with that, it was just myself and my son in Johannesburg, and I used and abused my son's nature and his vulnerability and his own addiction, and I would call on him regardless of his circumstances, of what he would be doing in his life. And, it was awful because I was now in my 50s and he was struggling with his own addiction, but he would always come. And I remember this one particular day, I was sitting in the kitchen and I had phoned him, and I had demanded that he come to me. And he walked through the kitchen door with a bottle of vodka and sat down at the kitchen table, and we both said nothing. We sat like that for about an hour, and we drank neat vodka out of coffee cups, And eventually he stood up and he stood with his back against the kitchen door, and he looked at me and he said, the first thing that we said that day was, he said to me, Mom, please don't phone me again because I won't come. And he left, and I didn't see him again for 10 years. But when I eventually got hold of him, like 3 days later, when I needed him, he wouldn't answer, and then I used somebody else's phone to get hold of him. He did answer that call, and it was myself, and I screamed at him, and I said, why aren't you answering the phone? And he took a deep breath, and he said, Mom, the only phone call I want from you is from somebody to tell me that you're dead. And that was the end of that relationship forever. I had done that. I had done that to him. I had done that to myself. I'd done that to his wife. I'd done that to my grandchild, and I still didn't see that. And it was then that soon after that I went into my first treatment. I thought, well, I've got to do something. I can't live in this big house all on my own and drink. And I wanted to die, and all the suicides in between. I was too drunk to be successful, and now if my son wasn't going to come around to help me through those unsuccessful events, what was I going to do? So I went into my first treatment center in 2012, and I went in there and I complied. For 3 months, I did everything that I thought they wanted me to do and to see and to hear. My daughter was a counselor there already, and the only consequence I had was a complete combine with her and she with me. So at the end of my 3 months, I'm sitting in a concern group, and so it was the day before I left, and just my going away group the next day. And in this group, a friend of mine that I made in treatment, she had a concern for me, and I still thought, I'm going tomorrow. I'm saying this is ridiculous. And she said, your only concern for Lynn is that she hasn't been concerned once in the 3 months that she's been here. And I was completely shattered, But, when I look at it now, And I look back at my life, there was a huge reason for that, and she was right. Because complying, I was just this person who did the right thing the whole time. And then I left and I was only sober for a month, not even a month. I did none of the pillars that was requested of me. 15 months later, I was back in treatment on House of the Hill, 2012, 2015. And there, that wasn't the same experience. I went in under family intervention. I went in kicking and screaming, completely the opposite to how I went the first time, the demure old lady. I went in there ugly, drunk, bitter, twisted, not even desperate. I didn't want to be there. And I remember a counsellor there standing in the admission saying, Lynn, you're a 61-year-old acting like a 16-year-old. And there, the relevance to being 16 and 61, actually, it was evident for something else that was still going to pop up, but I didn't see it at the time. And, I had been in this treatment center and I didn't want to be in there. I hated it. I wanted to get out and I couldn't get out. So I decided, okay, fine. I'd signed something that said I'd be there for 28 days, but they lied to me. So when it came to the 28 days and I couldn't go, I was furious. So I was throwing a happy fit in the office. And I remember something in my brain saying, the only way you can get evicted from the treatment centre is if you attack a counsellor. So now I was trying to decide which counsellor I was going to attack. Then I could get out of there. But I decided, okay, fine, my sponsor at the time said, okay, just stay for your life story. Just stay for your life story and then you can go. And she lied to me again. And so I stayed for my life story. And the feedback was horrific. It was really bad. It got worse, but it was bad at the time. And I remember going again to her and screaming at her and saying, you lied to me, I'm going. And she said, well, just wait until tomorrow. I said, I'm going now, I'm going to pack my bags. But what I did is I went and I cut my wrists. And I thought, well, if there's only one way out, this is what it's going to be like. And the shame and remorse and guilt I had over that episode has haunted me since. I've had to work through that. But my regret, of course, is for my peers. I put my peers and my counselors through that experience. And that was unforgivable. It was totally unforgivable. But I did it, and there was no going back on what I had done. But when I was lying in that hospital bed, I realized something, that my first real suicide attempt, I was 16. And I was clean and sober. I had not even picked up a substance yet. And my second one now, back in hospital, I was 61. And there again is the 16 and the 61. And there's no substance in my body whatsoever. And what that told me at that stage is that this has got nothing to do with the alcohol and nothing to do with anybody else out there. It is all to do with your own behavior. You've done this to yourself. Your behavior has brought you to these lengths. So needless to say, I did go back and I spoke to the owner, and he gave me mercy and grace to come back. And I was there for 6 months, and I got every single consequence that they had in the house. And that's a lot of consequences. And I remember waking up on that first morning and I had to begin the consequences, and I was in exile, but not in the gardens, within the house. And I was in exile as well, so I could not speak to anybody. And I said to myself that first morning when I prayed for the first time really, and I just said to God, just help me get through this day. And each night when I prayed, I thanked God. I said, God, thank you for getting me through this day. And what I did with those consequences, that I made each and every day count. I was determined that I was not going to get the better of myself. I had to make this work, and if this was how it had to be, then I had to do exactly what was asked of me. And I left the treatment center after 6 months of being there, and I truly loved it. I had gotten to, after 4 months, I could go back and do my steps privately, which I finished them. And I did. I loved the program. I loved the everything about it. At that stage, I was even planning that the owner put a cottage on the property for me, But I left there after 6 months, and I still stayed in Scotland for another year. So I'd been in Scotland in fellowship for 18 months, and I felt I had really good recovery. I was doing everything that was asked of me of the 5 pillars every day, and I was enjoying my recovery. But I left for a relationship. I left with secrets, and I left with reservations. And I knew that that's what I was doing. And my sponsor at the time begged me to stay another 6 months. She said, just stay another 6 months. And I didn't. And you know what I threw away was what I had gained. I had gained my daughter back in my life. I had gained my little grandson back in my life. I was clean and sober in recovery. I was doing service, but I left. And even at Kamas, I just thought, should I go over the bridge and go back? Because I knew that what I was doing I was not entirely sure that this was going to work, but I didn't turn back. And it took another 3 months. I used to claim that I was 21 months clean and sober when I relapsed that time, but I can only claim 18 months of that because from that bridge, my behavior had relapsed. And I couldn't claim that, but I did. For years, I did. And I went back, and within 3 months, I had relapsed. And I couldn't justify it, but all I wanted to do was that nobody from the treatment center should ever know about it. And so I spent the next 3.5 years literally floundering in the outside world, hiding myself, hiding my alcohol, disposing of my bottles when I could, hiding from people. I mixed with people who drank like me, just like my only saving grace that they didn't mind. We were all the same. I got myself into an old age home, and I felt relatively safe in the old age home, but it didn't stop me drinking. 2:30 in the afternoon, I was out of there, and eventually, in December 2020, I missed a booking that I had for a job in my diary, and it was the 5th of December, and I couldn't understand I thought, sure, I had a booking for this week, but obviously I haven't. And it was just like a trigger. Oh, well, I'm going to take this week off. So I went to my son's flat where I often went when I needed to drink, and I bought enough probably to last me 3 months, and I was going to stay for 5 days, And I only remember the first day and the last day of that week. I woke up in a blackout. I know I had been in psychosis, and that was the first time I experienced psychosis. And I didn't know what day it was, what time it was. I just knew that I was sitting in a bed, vomit and urine and disgust and fear like I've never felt in my life. I remember going into the shower and crawling there and letting the shower just pour over me in my clothes that I still wore for the 5 days I'd been there. And my justification for that was, well, they needed a wash anyway. And I remember crawling past the mirror in the passage and looking at myself in horror. And I think it was at that stage that I just knew, God, I need help. I'm going to die like this. And I sat there in the lounge and I looked at my cell phone for maybe an hour, and I knew I had to phone my daughter because I knew that was where the help would come from, and I knew she wouldn't turn me away. So she came, and I'd gotten myself back to the old age home, and she stood at the door, and that same expression was on her face that my son had when he stood at the door in the kitchen. And she just stood and we looked at each other. It was exactly the same. We'd said nothing. And she looked at me and she said, Mom, it's time. And I said, it's time. So she organized for me to go to the Midlands. And I got to the Midlands, and all I know is that I went in there blank. I had no fight in me, and that doesn't mean to say I surrendered, because I hadn't. I had just no fight in me, and I had no hope, and I felt completely helpless. And I kept saying to myself, what are you missing in this recovery? there must be something that you are missing. And I remember speaking to my sponsor at the time, and she had the same look on her face as me. It's like, what are we going to do with you? And I thought, well, I'm here now, So I went through my step 1 with her, and she kept scoring the pages out and saying, you're not connecting to your damages, you're not connecting to the harm. And, I didn't know what I was doing wrong, because the examples I were given were true examples. Like the kids at school, I forgot them at school. Or like my kid's wedding, I didn't drink on their wedding day. Those were the examples I was giving, So I went through those, step 1, 2, and 3, and then shit. So then I go into this life story, which was horrendous. The feedback was terrible. I thought this must be the worst feedback ever. But still, there was something missing. I still thought, well, they don't understand me. They just don't understand how hard it is to be a mother. They just don't understand. They haven't a clue. And the next day was a concern group. So now I went in there and I'm thinking, I'm very full of self-pity. I'm thinking, she's got this terrible life story. I have this terrible feedback, and I've got 4 counselors sitting in front of me now, but they'll leave me alone now because it's been bad enough, And there was a stupid little concern from somebody about, I don't know what I did, but that came up, and that's all that they needed. Sugar, and then they hit me with it. And this counselor and I didn't see anybody else in the room. It just went dead silent. I literally did not see anybody. It was just he and I sitting across from each other, screaming at each other. And I was ranting, and I was vicious, and I was rude, and I was crude. And I was sitting at the edge of my seat, and I was shouting at him. And he was telling me things about me that I was denying, And suddenly, everything stopped. And I remember sitting back in the seat and looking at him and thinking in my head, what if just happened? And he started this slow clap, and he looked at me and he said, there she is. There she is. And I said to myself, what? And I felt, and this is what I term as my surrender, because it was a physical experience. It felt that my entire body had turned to glass, like a windscreen does, and had just dropped to the floor. And I was standing in this puddle of glass, and I realized this is what surrender feels like. This is what it is. And that was a big turning point in my life, just getting there and realizing. And then afterwards, there was a session with my counselor then. I remember sitting there and him looking at me, and we talked about it a little bit more civilly. And he asked me, why do you want to be here? And I hadn't thought about it till I was asked that question, and I just said, because I want to get better. I just want to get better. I don't want to please my children, or to have my husband back, or to have a house, or to have animals. I just want to get better. And he looked at me and he said, and he asked me to look at him straight in the eyes, and he said to me, if you put your trust in me, you will get better. And at that moment, the fear and the burden of everything just lifted. And it was from that moment on that I truly believe my recovery began. Because I was able to go into my step 4 a different person. As an old man in the fellowship said to me when I came out of that concern group, he said, Lynn, you went in a dear, kind little old lady, and you came out real. And without that concern group, without that experience, I would have carried those masks with me, and I would have left there with the masks, and it would all have started all over again, and I would have no solution. So for me, the problem had to be me. The solution had to be the 12 steps in the program. And I did them, and I went to any length, and I was diligent about it, and I followed every single suggestion. given to me in those months that I was in Midlands. And I did my 12 steps, and I started to put into practice what I had learned, and to accept that I have had no experience in the outside world in recovery, living life on life's terms. I do have the experience of recovery in that I've done these 12 steps, I've done the solutions. I may not be able to put it into practice, but what it has taught me is making that connection to my children and to my fellows, because there's a lady in Howick who helped me see this. I had to see my children through their eyes, not me looking at them, and taking them back to that day at school when I left them at school. Instead of it all about me, I could stand there in the Midlands and under the trees there near the laundry, and I could look and I could see their eyes, and I could see the fear and the distress and the hopelessness and the helplessness in these little kids' eyes, and the fear, they were afraid of me. And I could see that, and I could understand that, and I could see when I looked back at the teacher who had been standing with them, instead of thinking, oh, it's that bitch, like I did at the time, I could see the horror in her eyes. And when I said to my children, you're too old to cry, and I looked in the rearview mirror, I could now see their eyes looking back at me. And they were children, but nobody is too old to cry. And it was from that moment on that I could make all the connection. I still make it now. When somebody else shares something, I pick up on a memory that's long gone, and I remember that. And then I can do that swap around. And that I'm telling you now is God's work. He's gotten me through this to where I sit here today, which is a miracle. And the other one I must go back to before I finish. That incident when the kids asked me to be sober at their wedding. I was sober at their wedding, but when I changed it around and I looked at my kids' eyes, my daughter in her beautiful wedding dress and my son so proud, I could see that there was still that fear. Is she going to make it? What's going to happen? And I didn't realize that I had been a build-up to this wedding. In each of these weddings, how is mom going to be? What are we going to do? I didn't realize that each of my adult children had a plan B to support each other in case mom made an ass of herself, which is very probable. And it was not, to me, it was a matter of one day. For that, it was damage, and damage is done for months and months, of build-up. So I needed to go back to that reference to show how important for me it was to find that I could make that connection. And I want to thank Josh, who's here today, for being my sponsor for the time that you were, and for showing me the way out, and for making me see who I am, and being there to support me right through. And I want to thank Cass more especially for being my support for all these years and years and years, and to tell you how proud I am of you, Cass. Cass is sitting here celebrating her 12 years, and that's not a coincidence, it's a God incident. I'm very grateful to the fellowship for being there for me, and more especially to the treatment centres, but more especially to Midlands, because without Midlands, what doesn't work for some people work for me, and for that I'm eternally grateful. Thank you for the leadership.